Hello, classes, Maloney and Pines. Uh, Welcome while I find the place here. Okay. Um, we're on a lesson this Sunday, the second lesson on the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors. And we're indebted to Heather from last week, giving us some background, in particular, that the Genesis, where our story comes from, was written during the Babylonian exile, and that's important since a lot was going on then, and I'll call them co-editors, and I want to think of Genesis as a textbook, and I'll tell you why. This is the beginning, of course, that's what Genesis means, the start. It answers the most basic questions you could put forth. Where am I from? What is my relationship with God, the Creator God? What is God like? What's my duty here? In order to obey God's will, what do I do? These questions were all formulated, rather they were compiled from the prehistory tradition up to that point that hadn't yet been written down. Now, this is the backdrop here is, when I call it a textbook, is that most, if not all, the families, all the children at that time, those readers and hearers of the Torah, what they're writing, were homeschooled. And I wondered, this is the curriculum. This is to answer the basic questions of my prehistory, me. It is personalized. So it's important to know, Heather brought out, it was written during a time which some upheaval was undergoing. In particular, the history of Israel was brought to mind by the writers. They know that the northern kingdom had dissolved. They, some centuries earlier, had gone into exile and had just disappeared. They had been absorbed into the culture of the place of exile, and that must have been on the top of their list of items that they were thinking about. Here they were in exile, or maybe just right after exile. And, when King Cyrus said, okay, folks, you can go back home, not everybody responded to that and came back home. They were in a pretty good position there, and the great unknown was, what am I going to do? Where will I live when I go back? And when they did go back, those that did go back, remember there was the great meeting in the rain. I'm sorry they complained about rain. Most of them were farmers. They ought to be raising glad hands in the rain. But they were told to send their foreign wives home. So I know the formulation of Genesis is just has to be guided by those thoughts in their heads about being true and staying the course for this covenant community. My own experience teaching over the years, I've had several textbooks for the same class, same course, in more than one course. And I know that there's a difference. It's not just nuances. Well, in mathematics, you have to have the same sequence of events because mathematics builds on itself. But there really are difference in clarity, and you can tell the authors are excited about this and not about that. Okay, so that's the background that I'd like to establish. That's how I'm viewing Genesis, is written by some co-authors, some very talented co-authors, as you'll see. Well, as was established at the first session of the Joseph story, here we are. Joseph, the favored one by his father Jacob, has come to meet his brothers out in wherever. And the brothers are so tired of him. He's such a thorn in their side, they decide they're going to kill him. Well, Judah comes to his rescue at the last moment, as it were. Now, these are the writers, their choice of words and how all this is put together. They fashion it so that it's right at the very last moment. Judah says, "Okay, no, let's not kill him. Oh, and look, here comes a caravan." It reminds me of the story of Isaac, the grandfather of these boys. When he and his father Abraham went out, Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and at the very last minute, God intervenes, and there's a ram in the brambles, and so he's rescued right from the very edge of being annihilated. The whole line of Israel, as promised to Abraham, would have been cut off right there. And I'm sure that the writers of Genesis are not unaware of that when they literally pick Joseph up out of the cistern, I think it was called, and handed him off to a caravan headed to Egypt. Well, how do the writers describe this caravan that they sold Joseph to? It's a band of Ishmaelites headed for Egypt. Get that. Ishmaelites headed for Egypt. Okay, well these homeschooled people to whom the writers are addressing this textbook know full well, they know that these people know who the Ishmaelites are and what the significance of Egypt is. But we better brush up a little bit on that. Okay, we go all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. And you know, Sarah was barren. This is Abraham's wife. And so God provided a servant, a slave, and her name is Hagar. She's from Egypt, and she then has a son by Abraham, and Hagar have a son. His name is Ishmael. All right. Then Sarah, who's really dominating force in this family of Abraham, the progenitor of the Israelites, she's complaining one day that, and finally, of course, Isaac is born. So the little boys, Isaac and Ishmael, are playing out, and Hagar and Sarah says, "I'm tired of this. Abraham, please let this boy is influencing Isaac, and I just don't want to see him anymore." So harsh. So Abraham listens to God, and God says, you listen to Sarah. So he packs Ishmael and Hagar off with a provisions. It sounds like a one-day provision off, and they just take off to another land, as the writers write. Okay. Well, Hagar sees the handwriting on the wall. She just can't stand. They get in the wilderness. They're out of provisions. She can't stand to watch her son die, so she walks off so she can't see him, and she can hear him wailing in the background. Well, here's another situation where somebody's about to die, but God steps in and acts and saves, in this case, Ishmael. Hagar looks up, and there's a source of water. She goes, fills the skin with water, goes back, and God then tells Hagar and Ishmael that Ishmael too will have a progeny in the thousands, and that he will be prosperous. Okay, so that, two things. One, did I mention that Hagar's an Egyptian? All right, so here this caravan shows up. Now we're back to the present, namely with Joseph in the session last week. Joseph is about to be sold off for Ken, his an uncle, for crying out. Well, it could be his uncle is in the crowd. And where are they going? Well, they're going to their mother's homeland. It's really interesting to me how that works out. All right, let's see where we are. So off goes. Well, let's look at the back at what I suggested earlier. The thoughts going through the textbook writers, namely the writers of Genesis, what the thoughts are going through their mind when they're framing this story. So far, they've got some images that are familiar to everybody. Two sessions, one Isaac about to be lost, about to be killed, and that now Ishmael, apparent arrival of Isaac, who was the grandfather of Joseph, and we brought those to fore. But I would think that the writers would also, seated there in exile or right after exile, would now be aware they knew the genealogy of Joseph and all the tribes of Israel. And they knew which tribes were the ones that gave up the covenant, as it were, and were absorbed into the culture of the surrounding land, and which tribes stayed on. All right, well, let's see. I'm looking at a chart that has the Jacob and all of his ancestors, and it is interesting to me now that parts of the story which I have mentioned related to this come to mind as I see this chart. You know, Joseph is described as Jacob's favorite. Well, how did they come by that, I wonder? Well, if we look at the story of Joseph before Joseph, namely the story of Jacob and Esau, then we will be aware of this characterization of Joseph being like he is. Who is Jacob? All right, so let's go back to school like the homeschoolers, and let's plumb that line for a second about Jacob and Esau and that story, which fits the situation right now. All right, Rebecca, I hope I get all of these names right. Rebecca is Isaac's wife. And you know, she gives birth to Jacob and Esau. And Esau is born before Jacob. I think they're meant to be twins, but I didn't prep on that. But whatever, Esau, by tradition, gets he's the senior brother of the two. And so he gets the inheritance and the blessing from Isaac. Well, now we learn something about Jacob that doesn't put him a very good light. And I'm thinking of the writers now. They're saying, look, your ancestors speaking to me and to you, and those of us in the tradition, covenant tradition, they're saying, your ancestors weren't perfect. In a way of telling us from when we talk about the basics of how things work in God's relationship with us mortals, that our ancestors weren't perfect either. Jacob was, as a little boy, actually his mother, Rebecca, when it came time, when Esau was away doing something else out in the fields, let's say, dressed up little Isaac, or maybe he's a teenager now, dressed him up with a hairy arm like Esau's. And Isaac by now is old and feeble and can't see very well. Long story short, Jacob comes to Esau and steals, comes to Isaac and steals Esau's inheritance, in effect. All right, what does that mean? Well, you can imagine Esau being put out, that this kind of conniving by his own mother and his brother. Well, at least the writers say that Jacob felt like he was in danger of losing his life. So he takes maybe what doesn't belong to him, namely the inheritance, and goes to another land. And leaves Esau behind. Esau doesn't follow him. And he's headed for a land that the writers prepare us that there's some kinfolk where he's headed. And so when the readers aren't so surprised, again, these are Genesis stories, same writer, co-authors of our textbook. When he comes to the land of his uncle Laban's, he stops at a well, just like you would imagine. And here's this beautiful woman there that just gets Jacob. He says, okay, I found my wife. And I get her name right. It's Rachel. And so he goes to Rachel's father, Laban, his uncle, and asks for Rachel to be his wife. Well, Laban says, no, you got to work for ump years. I forget how long it is. You got to marry Leah. Now, I can remember the first time I encountered this story. How I got this, I do not know. But I remember thinking of Leah, the oldest child, that Jacob had to marry, as being very plain, if not ugly, compared to Rachel. Well, he works and works and works, and he has, this is Jacob. So he marries Leah, and now I'm looking back at the genealogy that I got off the internet. With Leah, he has the following children: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Now, you remember we said here was the first thing that happened for this lesson is Judah intercedes. He's the one who says, "My brother, let's don't kill him. Let's sell him off to the Ishmaelites headed for Egypt." And Issachar and Zebulun, all of those. Well, apparently Rachel, like Sarah, was barren. So Jacob takes on two other wives, Zilpah and Bilhah. And one of them was Leah's slave, and the other one was Rachel's slave. And he has two children each with them. So Jacob finally gets to Rachel, the one he was hoped to marry in the first place, and has Joseph and Benjamin. So, as we said, the writers are not making this up. They know why Joseph was the favored one amongst all the brothers. All right. Well, what about the tribes? These are the 12 tribes, the children of Jacob. They're all led the tribes of Israel. And remember, again, these writers were sitting in the point of exile, and all but two of the tribes were, we'll say, bad guys. That is to say, they were the northern kingdom, and they absorbed into their land and culture and new gods of in their exile. So that you would expect the writers of this of Genesis to look down on those tribes, all 10 of them that didn't make it. But Judah was pointed out. He's one of the heroes in this. And of course, in the line of Judah are King David and Jesus. So the writers now, this is before Jesus, of course, but it's after King David. And so this fits nicely. I'm impressed by the work of the writers here and how they put together these things to capture the essence of what they believe to be the basics and the beginnings of our heritage, what was all about. Well, what about the tribes that were left? And they are Benjamin and Joseph's offspring. Actually, he had two. Joseph had two children, and they are considered tribal leaders that actually went into the northern kingdom, Manasseh and Ephraim. Well, now that's a little flaw in my scheme. When I began this, I was thinking the good guys would be the Benjamin tribe and the other tribe, which could it have been Judah that stayed? Yeah, I believe it was Judah that stayed loyal. So Judah and Benjamin were the tribes. Let's just make it up. So that part of it looks good for me. It was one of the ones, and yeah, sure, the Judeans were the southerners. Well, what about Manasseh and Ephraim? They are Joseph's offspring, and they were heads of two of the tribes that went off into and never were seen again. We'll leave that for a moment, but because we've got to make a little progress here along the story. So far, we've seen some influence, I think, of the position of these writers, co-authors of the textbook, which is Genesis, and how they framed the story of Joseph. Okay, I think the lesson today, in spite of the name of it, God rewards obedience, I think the lesson today focuses on dreams. And really not so much on dreams, but on the interpretation of dreams. You know what happens, and even us who not as much up on things as the first hearers, we know how this story comes out. Joseph rises to the very tip top. Well, that was one of the things that stuck in a thorn in the sides of his brothers, was that dream he had, his own dream, which he interpreted as being, one day I'm going to lord it over you and you're going to come crawling on your knees to me. Well, that comes true. And that was Joseph's interpretation of his own dream. And at this point, I'm going to say dreams and interpretation of dreams are the core of this lesson. And if I'm writing a textbook, I want to lay out that I don't mean just any dream. So we're going to put the word dream with a capital D and maybe boldface it so we can think of it. This is a dream. It is God's communication with people. That's what we mean by dream. And interpretation of the dream is to realize that that is God's word. Okay, so the first capital D dream in our story was the one that Joseph got. He interpreted, and we know it's the word of God because that's the way it comes out. Now, he's sold into slavery, and a lot of events pass, and he is thrown into prison. He was rising and rising and in favor of everybody, but Pharaoh's wife tries to trick Joseph, and as though Joseph were trying to rape her, and that was just isn't the case. Anyhow, Pharaoh could do nothing else but throw him in prison. All right, while he's in the prison, he gets two more dreams, and they're not his dreams, and these are capital D dreams. One by the cupbearer of the Pharaoh, and one by the baker of the Pharaoh. And the prison guard realizes what's going on. He's right there when these two people ask that Joseph interpret the dreams, and he says to the cupbearer, "You've got a bright future." And he tells the baker, he says, "Unfortunately, your dream, you really do have a bad future." And that's the way they come out. So when Pharaoh has these two dreams, one of fat cows and then one of lean, scrawny looking cows, and there's 7 each, you know what the interpretation is. Joseph is asked to come before the Pharaoh and make the interpretation, and Joseph now is explicit. He says God is going to send 7 years of plenty, and follow that with 7 years of drought, so there'll be no food. So my plan for this would be to store up grain during the 7 years of plenty so that we can live through what happens thereafter. We'll have some food. And of course, I don't want to poach on next week's lesson, but of course that comes true, and that validates Joseph's earliest dream back when he was a child, that it really does come to pass that here we've got Joseph second in command of the whole nation of Egypt, and his brothers come and so forth and so on. Okay, so there we've got the last piece of this, which I think makes sense to me, that's why this is about interpretation of dreams. But I was curious how our lesson writer, which I know of him, he's got a great reputation. It's Eugene Marsh, and doggone it, he doesn't get any credit until the next to the last page in the whole booklet. He's done a lot of writing and is sure enough expert. And I've used his ideas about lessons before. So there's got to be something behind how this lesson, rather than being about the interpretation of dreams as God's action, which I think it is, how in the world did they come up with God rewards obedience? And this is the way I'll end it. Let's see, where did I write it down? It's in the naming of Manasseh and Ephraim, Joseph's children, who were born of his wife is an Egyptian picked out by the Pharaoh. So here's what these names mean, and you better believe this is how the writers decided to set this up. Manasseh means this: God has, and of course, who names the children is Joseph. God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. So I'm sure the lesson writer, Eugene March, has seen this. That's the obedience part of this long, arduous trip, which at least coming from Joseph, he makes that clear. God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And then Ephraim, that name means literally, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So his land of his affliction, yes, his obedience, he stayed with believing that God was going to rescue him in the end. And boy, did it ever happen. And our lesson writer must have put this in. This is how he knew all of this stuff too. He knows a heck of a lot more than I do. Maybe that's how the name of the lesson comes about. Well, I've taken plenty of, more than my share of the time. Thanks for watching, and have a good week.